Hey kid, you know anybody who's got any ESP that the CIA might like to know about? Good evening, my washers and dryers, and welcome back to the Large Man, where we are on part 2 of my probably 4-part series on Thicc Nonficc for this year in 2022. We are currently going through Phenomena by Annie Jacobson, which is all about the secret experiments that the US government did to learn more about ESP, psychokinesis, and other unexplained phenomena. Last time we talked about part 1 in the prologue of the book, which focused on the early years, the post-World War II, and even during World War II years of this whole endeavor, meeting people like Andrzej Puchorish and Martin Gardner, who is a skeptic, and just meeting a whole bunch of people. But one person we were introduced to last time that we are going to focus on more in depth today is Uri Geller. And for those of you who don't recall, Uri Geller was an Israeli paratrooper who lived in Israel at the time, and he was really into map dowsing and spoon bending. And so, whereas in the previous part I did like a Zener card experiment, let me know how you did there, I'm going to take a page from Uri Geller's book and try to bend this spoon while talking about it. Just letting my brain wander using the matrix approach of there is no spoon. And just so you know that I can't physically bend it, this is me bending the spoon. You can see my muscles flexing and that it's not really pushing it at all. So we'll just see how it goes. Part 2, the CIA years, Chapter 6, The Enigma of Uri Geller. So we meet Uri Geller, Israeli psychic, and he made his money map dowsing for a guy named Moshe Dayan, who was the Minister of Defense in Israel. And his profile skyrocketed to celebrity when he predicted the death of Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser. We hear about like his boyish good looks and boundless charisma, which made him a very effective celebrity. Because if he just looked like any old regular guy, I don't know that a psychic would necessarily rise to the same level of prominence, or maybe they would. I don't know. But we hear more about map dowsing through the lens of Martin Gardner, who is a skeptic. And he said dowsing was pure pseudoscience. He said suspect in every way. Far from a harmless and inexpensive superstition, Gardner wrote, an untold number of dowsers throughout the world were being paid handsomely for their services. And to men of science, that seemed unacceptable and wrong. For context, Uri Geller, through his map dowsing endeavors, made upwards of £1 million per job, as reported by the Financial Times of London in 1986. But, that being said, it wasn't that people weren't doing it. And in fact, the US military tried some map dowsing back in the Vietnam War. According to a declassified memo, the Marine Corps said that they will again become interested in dowsing only when it can be conclusively demonstrated that the average Marine can employ the technique without regard to his personal convictions, confidence level, or subconscious development. Basically, they didn't want to start using map dowsing again if it was going to take some sort of compromise on behalf of the Marines. They wanted the guys to approach it almost like a very routine sort of way, rather than, having to tap into something. For Uri Geller, who had been map dowsing for Moshe Dayan, in 1971 there was a petition urging the Minister of Defense to give up his legally questionable hobby. Basically, a bunch of archaeologists got together and they're like, hey, quit map dowsing for special artifacts. Stop. And so Uri Geller can't map douse for him anymore, which means he is a man at a crossroads, about to be transformed from an obscure Israeli citizen to one of the most scrutinized entertainers in the Western world. Because now that he doesn't have a job with the Israeli government, he has an opportunity to be picked up by literally anyone, and be picked up by literally anyone he was. He got the attention of a guy named Rubenstein, and Amnon Rubenstein, who's a legal scholar, and he was the host of a popular show called Boomerang. And they bring on Uri Geller onto Boomerang to talk to him. And Rubenstein says that Uri has the unusual power of influencing other people's thoughts. And he wondered if this was, something concentrated, or if this was just Uri getting lucky every time. So I mentioned at the beginning that Uri Geller's profile rose to extreme prominence when he predicted the death of Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser. And when he predicted the death of President Nasser, he did this in the fall of 1970. So this is right before his kind of contract/working relationship with Moshe Dayan kind of fell to the wayside. He ended up in smaller and smaller theaters after that point. And it just so happened that at one of those smaller theaters, a guy named Andrzej Puchorish was there and was very interested in what Geller could do and thought that his abilities would be of a huge interest to the CIA. Once Geller and Pufrish kind of connect, we move into chapter 7, which is titled Man on the Moon, which is all about a guy named Ed Mitchell, who's an astronaut. And he is preparing to go to the moon for Apollo 14. He conducts long-distance mind-to-mind telepathy experiments while he's in space. He does a lot of like Zener card experiments while he's out in orbit. I believe managed to land on the moon, but they're like way off from where they want to go, and they eventually have to like abort and go back to the command module. But you know, even though they had to kind of bail on what their original goal was, Ed Mitchell had a very profound realization in space. And he continued to do the Zener card experiments while he's in space, and he kind of gets dubbed the Uri Geller of astronauts, according to an Israeli newspaper. He said he understood one universal truth, that man is connected to other men through consciousness. That was the link between inner space and outer space, and he felt a peacefulness that he had never experienced before. This chapter in particular is a good example of a chapter that demonstrates there's a lot of information in this book that I'm just not going to go over. It goes into more of the details of the attempted moon landing that they make for Apollo 14. But this review is not meant to replace your experience reading the book, so if you're interested in learning more, I do encourage you to read the book. And both for the sake of time and just for my own kind of takeaway from these chapters, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail. It's kind of like if you watched my Stalin Court of the Red Tsar series, I didn't focus a whole lot on World War II because that wasn't my niche. That's not something that I know a ton about, and I encourage you to seek out other information. So we get into chapter 8, titled The Physicist and the Psychic. And here we meet Harold or Hal Putov, who works at the Stanford Research Institute, and he writes a letter to a guy named Cleve Baxter, who is a CIA analyst who co-founded the Polygraph program. Putov says that the year 1972 was a unique time to be an American physicist with links to the Defense Department. He said that in the aftermath of World War II, science became swept up in a wave of technology. Everything was about mechanization, about apparatus-based inanimate physics. In general, any kind of philosophizing about physics dropped away. Meanwhile, we meet Cleve Baxter, and the way they're connected is Hal Puthoff writes to Baxter because Baxter had been doing experiments that kind of tied into that idea. So Baxter's story is kind of interesting because we get an anecdote from 1966, so about 6 years before this encounter takes place, where Cleve Baxter wondered what would happen if he administered a polygraph to a plant. And the way he kind of comes about this is he had been up late working in his office. He wanted to see if like the plants had kind of the same kind of impulse reaction. And he gets all the sensors hooked up and he's like, no, let's just see how the plant responds to stress. And he ends up setting the houseplant on fire and seeing whether the polygraph recorded a change. Like, did the plant physically respond to being set on fire? And it did. It moved the ticker on the polygraph, and so he was convinced plants have consciousness. And he wrote up his findings in a thing called Evidence of a Primary Perception in Plant Life, which was published in the International Journal of Parapsychology in 1968. Skeptics weren't impressed. Scientists weren't impressed because they're like, plants don't have a nervous system, dude. Baxter stood by his experiments saying, such high resistance to new ideas does not concern me, he said. I have a truly wonderful ally, Mother Nature. They connect with a guy named Ingo Swann, who was an artist, but also kind of like they're sensitive, they're psychic for these experiments that they wanted to do. And Ingo Swann was kind of really into I believe out of body experiments. And after kind of a bummer of a night out on the town with some of the press weren't really impressed with what he was doing in particular. He decided to accept Hal Puthoff's offer to work with him and Cleve Baxter on some of their work. So they set up an experiment where they basically have this magnometer, and the goal was to bring in a bunch of witnesses to confirm that Swan could not cheat this test and get him to move the needle on this magnometer by influencing the magnetic fields that it was monitoring. And he did. He was able to move it in the experiment. It kind of shocked them. They walked over to the recorder and pulled off the paper. They put all of these findings together, and Puthoff wrote the findings and sent his report to various colleagues at SRI and on the East Coast. And weeks passed, they didn't hear anything. Eventually, though, he gets a knock at the door. And when he opened the door, he was surprised to find two men standing in the threshold. A copy of my magnometer, I've been saying that wrong, I apologize, magnetometer experiment report. And they're from the CIA. They're like, hey, neat experiment you got there. Would you be interested in doing it for the CIA? We get into chapter 9, titled Skeptics versus the CIA. This is kind of the CIA's first foray into researching ESP and PK phenomena. Up until now, it has primarily been offshoots of the Navy or independent researchers, and they are getting ready to set all of this up, and they send out a memo in amongst other CIA operatives that says, we are not in the business of pursuing paranormal phenomena per se, but we try not to be arrogant about it, which is what a lack of objectivity about any issue usually amount to. There will be no rehashing of anecdotal accounts. There will be no idle discursive speculation about the dynamics or meanings of the phenomena. That is what we hope eventually to establish. Just kind of setting the bar of like, I don't care if you believe it. That's not what we're here to discuss. We're just here to see if it works, period. And they're getting ready to bring in Uri Geller, which in some ways is a bit of a security concern because Uri Geller is such a prominent celebrity. When Puharish first proposed this idea to the CIA, Geller had become an international phenomenon. From Barbara Walters to Brigitte Bardot, fans around the world could not seem to get enough of Uri Geller as he bent spoons, read minds, and performed simple telepathy acts. And in fact, one of the celebrities that he encountered was Werner von Braun, who is a rocket scientist and former you-know-what, who was impressed. He met von Braun, and he had Geller influence the electrical system on an electric pocket calculator because it wasn't working. And so when the Pentagon heard, they're like, okay, give us a write-up on that. We kind of want to know about that. So give us the deets. They take care of all of this. They get Geller in and doing experiments. And so between December 1st, 1972 and January 15th, 1973, Hal Puthoff and his partner Russell Targ, they completed 9 days of official tests. And these tests were like a mixed bag. They expressed concern that Puthoff and Targ's own experimental bias in favor of successful outcomes is undermining their objectivity in properly controlled experimental procedures. Citing again Gardner's gripes with these experiments, that there are loose laboratory controls, the data gets skewed, and the premise that the attitude of the scientists conducting the experiments has an influence on the outcome. So we get into chapter 10, which introduces a new kind of ESP experiment that is known as remote viewing. And basically remote viewing is where a psychic can see kind of through the eyes of someone else who goes to a different destination. And they, Puthoff and Targ, are working on experiments to try and demonstrate a form of long-distance mental telepathy, previously known as traveling clairvoyance. And they bring in Swan to kind of help with these experiments. And Swan was underwhelmed. These ESP experiments are a trivialization of my abilities, he said, complaining that the experiments felt like grown-ups playing childish spy games. And Swan figured that the CIA was actually looking to find classified military facilities deep inside the Soviet Union. And the inaccessibility of these targets was the problem, he told Puthoff and Targ, and their team should be working on a way to address that real-world challenge. And he has a point. You know, it doesn't matter if Puthoff and Targ can drive to some remote location if it is a remote location that they themselves can access. Swan isn't going to be able to look through the eyes of Puthoff and Targ to find a deep underground secret Soviet facility, because that kind of defeats the whole point of remote viewing. Chapter 11, The Unconscious, opens with a quote from former CIA Director Alan Dulles. who gave a speech in April 1953 during the early days of the Cold War, wherein he said, it is the aim of the Soviet Union to condition the mind so that it no longer reacts on free will or rational basis, but responds to impulses implanted from outside, which kind of explains the drive to find mind-altering drugs that we talked about in part 1 and in some of the experiments that we're going to get into today. In the early 70s, Geller goes to a variety of shows to perform his work, and one he goes on is a radio show with Jimmy Young, where Geller bends a spoon on the radio show. And after bending that spoon, Jimmy Young exclaims, oh my gosh, it's bending right in front of me. I can't believe it. And so Geller encourages all the listeners at home to do the same thing. But, people all over the United Kingdom believed that they could bend spoons with their mind. People were being able to pull it off. And this was the chapter where, I set the book down and I again was like, how much coincidence until it is no longer coincidence? Things like this, of this kind of mass hysteria. It does happen. People can mass hallucinate. People can believe things en masse that aren't true. But I was genuinely curious, how viable is this thing? And so I'll kind of take the point now to ask, where do you stand on stuff like this? Are you a sheep or a goat in that respect? And I don't know. As these experiments are happening, as Geller's doing all of these, interviews, tours and stuff, we have another probably familiar name who begins to object to these practices, and that is Carl Sagan, the cosmologist. He was particularly offended by the public's acceptance of Uri Geller, saying, "Why the sudden explosion of interest, even among some otherwise sensible people, in all sorts of paranormal happenings? Are we in retreat from the scientific ideas of rationality, dispassionate examination of evidence, and sober experimentation that have made modern civilization what it is?" And Sagan and a bunch of other scientists and intellectual types pushed back against kind of this public acceptance. And the book says, fight back as their group would, it had no bearing on the decisions made at CIA. It didn't matter if the people at the CIA believed it or didn't believe it. It was the decision to invest time and money into these experiments, because if the Soviets could build super weapons that worked from the brain, CIA wanted to have something similar. That is kind of where chapter 11 ends, and we get into chapter 12 titled Submarines. And here's where some things get pretty interesting. I think this was probably my favorite chapter so far, just with kind of the experiments that they start doing with some of the work and some of the payoff of what they're working on. It opens with kind of a discussion of how in the early days of looking into this, no one really knew for sure where this ESP phenomena came from. And, they try to attribute it to God, possession, just everyone guessing to try and figure it out. But, it says then roughly 150 years ago, with the development of a theory to explain electromagnetic waves formed when an electric field couples with a magnetic field, the focus turned to the electromagnetic spectrum as a possible source of ESP, which gave kind of the idea that telepathy was kind of mental radio, which kind of makes sense. And this opened up a bunch of other research opportunities. Over the next 3 decades, with the discovery and development of radar, microwave ovens, and space communications, the idea that the electromagnetic spectrum might explain anomalous mental phenomena widened in theoretical possibility. And some of the applications of this rose up specifically in the world of submarines, where in the early 1970s, a minority group showed interest in ESP as a possible backup means of communication in a post-nuclear strike environment. If you have no other means to communicate, maybe we can use ESP to get these messages across. While the US was doing experiments into ELF and mind control, the Soviet Union were developing ways to try and enhance psychic functioning by bombarding test subjects with very high frequency or VHF sound and pulsing the brain with electromagnetic signals. Soviet researchers sought to bring humans to the razor's edge between sleep and wakefulness and to facilitate hallucinations and altered states. The idea of bringing humans to the razor's edge between sleep and wakefulness reminds me of the creepypasta of the Russian sleep experiments, which may not even be a creepypasta. I forget. I'm gonna put the actual thing here. I write out the notes that I'm gonna say from the book, and if I stumble upon something while talking, I have to look it up after the fact. So Russian sleep experiment, real or not? Because the ELF story leaked, Pudov and Targ's contract with the Navy was kind of in jeopardy. Their funding had been cut because the security breach was a bad thing. So they wanted to find access to a submarine to test the ESP and ELF theory, and there was really no option they had until a guy named Stephen Schwartz, who was a former naval officer who had served as special assistant to Admiral Zumwalt, and he was very interested in those connections, and he said in 2016, I wanted to see if a remote viewer could locate a previously unknown shipwreck on the sea floor, and he thought those applications would be worth looking into. This opportunity worked in their favor, and they got in contact with a guy named Dale Graff, who was a civilian scientist who worked with the Air Force. And Dale Graff believed that there were applications that the Air Force would be interested in, and so he was very interested in helping Pudov and Targ with this experiment. They set up an experiment with a submarine called the Taurus, and once it was deep underwater, at a predetermined time, the psychics and the scientists were each given a set of 6 sealed envelopes. When the time came, Pudov and Graff chose one of the 6 envelopes, opened it, and then drove to a site and remained there as a beacon for the psychic in the submarine. So there would be a psychic in the submarine and scientists who would have 6 envelopes, and they would go and drive to that location, and the psychic would have to determine while in the submarine what location they were looking at. Seated inside the submersible 500 feet and 375 miles away, a psychic named Hella Hamid quickly identified which photograph she believed was correct, which makes for a great story, but is also a 1 in 6 chance, not the worst odds. But, even with the odds aspect of it, the fact that it could be possible, Graff said was, that's a serious implication to consider, especially from a counterintelligence point of view. He pointed out that among them was the idea that there was no way to hide classified information from a talented remote viewer like Hella Hamid or Ingo Swann, which was something to consider. It's like, look, there may not be any secrecy that we can maintain if there are people who can do this. And so being able to test it and control those variables and find out how it worked could be very beneficial when they ran into situations where it's like, they know they can see it, and so they wanted to do the experiment so that they could use it to their advantage, but also protect themselves from any disadvantages. That is everything for part 2 with working for the CIA and doing some of those remote viewing. As you can see, I do not have latent psychic abilities. I have not bent my spoon. Wouldn't that be weird if it just bent right now? That'll pretty much do it for me. Thank you so much for watching. As always, as necessary disclaimer, I am not a historian. I am only presenting the information as it appears in the book, and I'm not pretending to know anything else beyond that. Thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned for part 3 of the Thicc Nonfic series. I hope you're having a lovely evening, and I will see you next time.